Hey everyone, Mr. Happy here, and welcome to Final Fantasy Bestiary. This series is dedicated towards discovering the history and lore behind Final Fantasy's most iconic creatures and characters. This episode is one with a bit more focus. In the recent trailer for Final Fantasy XIV's patch 4.5, a certain figure from Final Fantasy XI reared its ugly head. Absolute Virtue. With players from Final Fantasy XIV maybe not familiar with the legacy this creature left behind, I wanted to use this series to dive into a bit of his history. So first off, unlike most of our other bestiaries, Absolute Virtue is a creature exclusively from Final Fantasy XI. It has appeared in the mobile game Final Fantasy Record Keeper as a boss, but the original monster had only appeared in Final Fantasy XI prior to his revival in Final Fantasy XIV. His namesake is an obvious reference to the 7 heavenly virtues often used in medieval Christianity, the New Testament, and ancient Greece. There are 4 cardinal virtues and 3 theological virtues, which you'll recognize the names of as we get later into the video. The 4 cardinal virtues are prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance, while the 3 theological virtues are faith, hope, and love. While there are other religious virtues and even the contrary virtues to mention, which do have some relation to Absolute Virtue, these 7 are directly related to him, the method of spawning him, and even his eventual loot list. Absolute Virtue was first made available in Final Fantasy XI as a boss that was part of the Chains of Promethea expansion pack. After clearing through the story and opening up the forgotten land of Lemuria, players could battle its inhabitants through a complicated series of bosses, eventually leading to Absolute Virtue himself. First in the Grand Palace of Hujoi and the Garden of Ru'hmet, players would encounter several powerful Lemurians known as Ix'aerns, which possess different jobs and skill sets. These creatures would drop manifestations of memories, such as deeds, to help spawn further bosses or, in the case of vices, traded in for loot. Alongside these Ix'aerns, players are introduced to the first 3 jailers of virtue: fortitude, temperance, and faith. Very little is known about the purpose of the jailers, even their namesake is a bit of a question, but it's presumed that they specifically are a jailer that possesses the virtues in question, as defeating them rewards physical manifestations of said virtues. Upon defeating and gathering the items the Ix'aerns and the first 3 jailers dropped, players exit the palace and head back out to Al-taieu, the celestial capital of Lemuria, and probably horribly mispronounced. Out here, they use those items to spawn the next 3 jailers, which are Justice, Prudence, and Hope. Upon defeating these 3, you will have the 4th, 5th, and 6th virtues, which you can bring to a corner tucked away in Al-taieu, where you can then trade them to face the Jailer of Love. This is easily the most threatening jailer, but it is also the final barrier preventing the release of the true danger beneath Lemuria. Upon defeating the Jailer of Love, a voice rises up out of the ground. At last the time has come, the scattered fragments of my thoughts once again mine, long forgotten memories filling me once more. However, these memories generate suffering, these thoughts bring remorse. Tell me, for what searcheth thou to travel this far? Show me by what principles art thou driven. With this, Absolute Virtue appears, and all hell breaks loose. While Absolute Virtue was first made available on July 19, 2005, specifically in the update that came out that day, it would be almost 3 months before anyone had gone through the spawning process we detailed and actually made him appear. In fact, back then, he wasn't even guaranteed to spawn upon Jailer of Love's defeat. That's changed, but back then it wasn't 100%. So for many players, it was a good deal longer before they ever encountered him. Despite the power of the creatures prior to him, Absolute Virtue was on another plane of existence compared to anything else in the game at the time. So what made him so difficult? What gave him this legacy? Well, the first part is the boss himself. Absolute Virtue's stats and his devastating attacks meant he would essentially steamroll any players he set his sights on, auto-attacking them for upwards of 500 damage, and that's just the most basic thing that he could do. He possessed the most powerful wind magic at the time, as well as Comet and the deadly Meteor spell. He also possesses a number of dangerous skills that other Aerns use, though his high stats can make almost any of them lethal. He could even summon 3 pet Wynavs to deal with this as well, basically Lemurian wyverns. All of this paled in comparison to his most notable trait, he was able to use the deadliest skills of all the jobs released up to the point of his implementation, known as 2-hour skills since they had a 2-hour cooldown when players used them. He not only could use all 15 of these skills, but he could use them as many times as he wanted. This included the White Mage's Benediction ability, which would heal him to full, as well as the Chain Spell and Mana Font skills, which would allow him to instantly and infinitely spam his deadliest spells, including Meteor. If you survived all of that and started chipping away at his health, eventually you'd have to deal with Bracelet mode. These bracelets are a common trait to other Ix'aerns, activated when they lose some of their health. They enhance the user's stats further, and in Absolute Virtue's case, grants him free access to cast Meteor whenever he pleases. It also gives him access to chain certain 2-hour skills together, using them in the most deadly way possible. Upon initially discovering Absolute Virtue, everyone started theorizing on how to actually deal with the menace. A fair fight was almost entirely out of the question, considering what he did to anyone he set his sights on. Groups suspected that ebon panels within the palace might have something to do with it, as they did not and still do not to this day have any purpose in the game. Perhaps they had to fight the other jailers in the zone simultaneously, or hit him with the weapons that the jailers dropped. Perhaps they had to speak to the Quasi-Lumen NPCs in the area, or maybe they could help with the battle directly. No one could figure out a real method for slaying what he was. His regen was too high, 500 HP per tick, which is about every 3 seconds in Final Fantasy XI, and his damage was just absurd. All of this just made it so that he just seemed undefeatable. No one could figure out what a fair method for slaying him was, and players would take shifts keeping the boss from despawning for days, trying to make any sort of sense of the matter. This eventually led to some unfair methods being discovered. At least they were deemed unfair by Square Enix. Players would try to create differences in elevation to avoid his deadliest spells, but this didn't really help in killing him. Eventually, one method that gained massive popularity was known as the Wall of Justice. Over by where the players fought the Jailer of Justice, way on the other side of the map, was a thin wall separating 2 parts of the map itself. One party would slowly drag him over there, while the other parties were on the other side of the wall awaiting him. Apathy on Remora, that link shell, successfully accomplished this and discovered that by having the tank on one side of the wall and Absolute Virtue on the other, they could stop him from using the majority of his attacks except for his magic and his 2-hour skills. This allowed them to begin to chip away at his health, even through his regeneration. Eventually, they were hit with the issue of infinite benedictions, and after over 30 hours of holding him at that wall with players taking sleep shifts to ensure they avoided health problems, they let him go and he despawned. At this point, Square Enix had received a great deal of backlash due to problems with defeating Absolute Virtue, and then they released a poorly received video giving minor hints on how to defeat him, leading the players to learn that casting spells depending on the element of the day and defeating tons of the Jailer of Love's ads would help reduce his regeneration. It also showed that to stop him from using 2-hour skills repeatedly, players had to use the same 2-hour skill as Absolute Virtue within 2 to 3 seconds of him using it, which was incredibly difficult for players to do outside of Japan due to latency. I've spoken to players who attempted this back in the day, and those who were successfully able to lock jobs when they were in North America or Europe were actually forced to use third-party programs to make sure that it activated quick enough. Pretty absurd. With this information, he was defeated using the Wall of Justice in, I believe, 8 to 10 hours if memory serves. However, he dropped no loot, presumably because the GMs that were watching the whole time had disabled it. And on top of that, those same GMs issued the link shell involved warnings for using terrain exploits. Other groups had also managed to kill him at this point. However, this often came from a bug that would cause him to stop using any actions except his auto attacks, thus making it just about lowering his HP to 0 and not about actually doing the mechanics. At this point, it's presumed there were no legitimate kills at level 75. Reports of legitimate kills occasionally came through, but little in the way of proof, such as video or loot, were seen. Now keep in mind when I say this, I'm specifically speaking about the period prior to what we're about to talk about. So I'm not referring to saying there were no kills at 75. Trust me, there were, but we'll talk about how they came to be in a second. In late 2008, Square Enix received major negative press thanks to a Yahoo article detailing a newer super boss that was added in the Treasures of Ix'aern expansion pack, Pandemonium Warden. A group had spawned him and been in combat with the creature for almost 18 hours straight. While they did make it to 75% health remaining on the boss's final of its, at the time, 21 different forms, each of which was its own super boss, this would eventually be lowered to 11 forms, they reportedly began to pass out and vomit from exhaustion and just no more adrenaline rush. It had worn off, the excitement was gone, especially after they concluded there really wasn't any room to speed up the encounter, and they were looking at the very least, another 6 hours to finish the boss off. This led the development team to significantly nerf the health bars and mechanics of both Pandemonium Warden and Absolute Virtue, while also placing a strict time limit on those encounters, causing them to despawn instantly if not defeated in the 2-hour allotment they had provided. It did also lead portions of the hint video that Square Enix released earlier that year to be rendered a little bit useless, though the 2-hour locking method was still very important. This led to Absolute Virtue's first legitimate defeat. At least we like to call it a legitimate defeat. At this point, hardcore endgame players were using a method of throwing overwhelming offense at bosses, chain stunning them, and destroying them at blazing fast speeds. This was happening in all sorts of content from Treasures of Ix'aern forward. The most popular job for this was Dark Knight, as they could use their Soul Eater skill to greatly increase the damage that they do at the cost of losing health every time they attack. However, with their 2-hour skill Blood Weapon, they would heal based on damage dealt, so they really didn't lose any health with this combination. Now combine that with a ton of party buffs and multi-hit weapons such as the Kraken Club, which could attack 2 to 8 times per swing. Several Link Shells began defeating Absolute Virtue, ignoring all of his offense and killing him before retaliation was possible, even though he was immune to stuns. The reason why I say we view it as a legitimate defeat is because clearly Square Enix didn't like that method, because this led the development team to nerf that method and render the boss once again seemingly unbeatable. It wouldn't be until the level cap lifted above 75 that Square Enix would accept a player-used method, in that of simply zerging him down without using Dark Knights and Soul Eater. This was able to be accomplished due to the increased stats on equipment and the introduction of Alexander as a special summon. With his perfect defense skill, players can mitigate the oncoming damage and overpower Absolute Virtue with massive buffs. Nowadays, defeating him is significantly easier with item level armor. I even went back and soloed him on my Puppet Master for some footage for this video, but they did introduce a level 150 version called Warder of Courage to give players a new challenge in the current game. Players have a much easier time with the Warder than they ever did with the original Absolute Virtue, especially with the sheer amount of power players can possess at this point, and some changes to the mechanics that were made for Warder of Courage. Over the course of Final Fantasy XI's existence, Absolute Virtue always loomed over the player base as a horror story. Hours, days, months, years wasted, making no progress on a creature that it simply felt wasn't designed to be beaten in the first place. Rumors, exploits, bugs, Zerg strats all reigned supreme, even if several of them were nerfed into the ground. Again, I say that there were no real legitimate kills other than that zerging method, but I have to believe out there somebody beat him and the news just didn't splash. It's not that it couldn't be done, but it was so agonizingly tedious between going through the entire spawning method, between actually getting everything in place, between knowing that one slip up of someone using the wrong 2-hour and needing to bring all the different 2 hours to lock all the most dangerous things was just so not worth the effort. His gear was there and his gear was somewhat good, but outside of the Zerg method, you just didn't see anyone care. Now fast forward to 2018, soon to be 2019, Absolute Virtue looks to be making his return in Final Fantasy XIV, a day I've long expected. In the recent patch 4.5 trailer, the final zone of the Eureka content, Hydatos, was teased. Being that Hydatos means water, and the player given nickname for Al-taieu was sea, as in an ocean, It was hypothesized the Lemurians might make an appearance here, especially because Eureka is sort of a love letter within Final Fantasy XIV to Final Fantasy XI in many ways. In the trailer, deep within the new public dungeon, as they're calling it, that exists inside of Hydatos, we see none other than a giant Lemurian Ix'aern wielding a spear and instantly casting meteor spells on the players. Now, it's not confirmed that this creature is going to be named Absolute Virtue, but you can bet your ass we know that it's really him. Now, let me be clear about something. There's no doubt this new version will be defeated much more easily than his original counterpart. Absolute Virtue's design was particularly difficult in Final Fantasy XI because of his overwhelming stats, incredibly cryptic nature, and difficult to execute secret tricks. This is why the majority of methods involved breaking the game or defeating him before he could hurt the party. In Final Fantasy XIV, there's a lot more clarity, and it's unlikely the creature will stand against the players very long once they are a high enough elemental level to tackle him. That being said, Absolute Virtue facing off against a horde of players, one-shotting them constantly and causing panic in players' hearts, this is sure to be a sight that gives Final Fantasy XI players a bit of a smile as they think, if you only knew. Well, after watching this video, now you do. And that's going to be a wrap for this episode of Final Fantasy Bestiary. Hopefully you enjoyed this deep dive into the history of Absolute Virtue, and be on the lookout because we do have more Bestiary videos planned, as I have a bunch of them listed out, and this one kind of just interrupted my schedule that I was about to have set because 4.5 trailer had to do it. Anyway, be sure to like, favorite, subscribe, and share, and stay tuned for more Bestiaries on the channel. Be sure to check out the other content, especially if you're a Final Fantasy XIV fan, and I will see you all in the next one. Until then, take care.